The subject of worship should draw all of our attention to the object of worship. Namely, the Christian's worship is focused on the Creator of this universe. And therefore, as we consider expressing our reverence, devotion, and praise to this awesome God, our hearts should be struck with the seriousness of what we're doing. And then, as these lessons will focus on the responsibility Christian men have been given to lead people in this worship, we should immediately recognize the tremendous responsibility that has been given to us. However, I fear that we have taken one of the greatest responsibilities that could ever be entrusted to our care and failed to treat it with the seriousness that it deserves. Some neglect this responsibility entirely. Some refuse to do all that they can to fulfill this responsibility. Some abuse this responsibility. Some do not properly prepare themselves for this responsibility. But as Christian men, we should not just view this as a tremendous responsibility. Instead, it is also a tremendous opportunity. There is little that we can do in our lives that is more important than leading others in the worship of the one great and true God. Whenever a Christian man does the best that he can do in leading others in worship, it is a truly fulfilling experience. Not only has that man offered acceptable worship to God himself, but his leadership has helped others do the same. So given the seriousness of the responsibility and the magnitude of the opportunity God has given Christian men to lead others in worship, we should do something to actively train ourselves and others for this work. Surely such a wonderful work is worth doing to the very best of our abilities, and surely such a work is worth spending some time to improve ourselves. It is to this end that I'm preparing these studies, that men might become more effective in worshiping God themselves and in leading others in worship. During this first lesson, I hope to accomplish 4 things. First, I want us to gain a better understanding of our worship. Second, I want us to recognize the responsibility God has given to men of the congregation for leading His worship. Third, I want us to recognize the need to train men in leading worship. And fourth, I want to set some expectations for this course. In order to prepare ourselves for the work of leading worship, I believe it's extremely beneficial to take a big step back and look at the big picture of what we're preparing to do. So we will look at some of the most basic facts of worship. The who of worship, the what of worship, the why of worship, the how of worship, the where of worship, and the when of worship. Though we will only be able to consider the most basic of these points, these will frame our minds to better understand the work we are attempting to do. Let's begin by thinking about the who of worship. There is only one who to receive our worship, and this must be God. Whenever God delivered the 10 Commandments to Moses, He said in Exodus 20, verses 2 through 6, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. This God is the creator of the universe, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He is without beginning and without end. He is unlimited in power. He possesses all knowledge of all things. He sees everything. He is everywhere. He is entirely pure. He is full of love, grace, and mercy. He sacrificed His own life to save you from the consequences of your sin. He is full of truth. And this God is a jealous God. Since he is the only true God, he does not permit you to worship any other. And therefore Jesus Christ said in Matthew 4 and verse 10, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." Then we want to think about the what we do when we worship. The word worship gets easily confused. For instance, there are many people who consider worship just to be the things that we do. So to them, worship is a specific act or set of activities. But this is a very shallow view of worship. Though, as we'll see later, there are specific things that are involved in worship. There are several Hebrew and Greek words that are translated worship in the pages of the Old and New Testaments, but they have very similar meanings. For instance, look at an example of worship in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 9. It says, "And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, Rejoice. So they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him." What is it that these women did whenever they saw the resurrected Christ? They fell down before him and held him by his feet. And then the word for worshipped is in this very verse gives the picture of kissing toward out of reverence. These women could physically fall down before Jesus and show him this kind of respect. However, since God does not exist in the flesh today, we cannot express our worship by literally falling at his feet and expressing our reverence. But we accomplish this same thing spiritually by bowing our hearts in humble adoration of God and offering him the sacrifices of worship that he desires. Then think about the why we worship. To worship God properly, the why must be clearly defined in our minds. After all, worship requires us to take time out of our schedule to focus on another. And true worship will require effort to be made. Then leading the worship will require us to step outside of our comfort zones and worship God in front of other people. So why should we devote so much of ourselves to worship this God and put ourselves in potentially vulnerable situations? The answer can be seen in Revelation 4, a chapter that gives us a glimpse into the throne room of heaven. The first verses 2 through 11 say, "Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne, in appearance like an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the throne proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal. And in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature like a calf, the third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. The 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. Whenever God created mankind, he created us in his own image, Genesis 1, verses 26 and 27. This means that, like God, we are spiritual beings, and therefore we have a built-in longing to worship something or someone greater than ourselves. Unfortunately, the history of man reveals that mankind has not always chosen the right object to worship. And as we can see from the spectacular picture in Revelation 4, only the one true and living God is worthy of our worship. For he is the one who has created all things, and thus we should long to worship only him. Next, consider the how we worship. Throughout this series, we'll be discussing how we worship God in greater detail. For now, I just want to focus on the criteria for our worship. We can find the criteria in John chapter 4 and verses 23 and 24. Jesus said, "But the hour is coming and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." As Jesus identifies how people engage in true worship, we first notice that worship is to be in spirit. As spiritual beings made in the image of God, who is spirit, we must worship him in a heartfelt and sincere way. So as we worship God, we cannot merely go through the motions and expect that our worship will be acceptable to God. Instead, we must be fully engaged in our worship with our entire spirits, truly bowing our hearts before him and kissing toward him in deep reverence. Then, our worship must also be in truth. That is, our worship must be according to God's divine standard. You see, he has prescribed a certain kind of worship that will be pleasing to him, which we'll consider later in this lesson. He has not left it up to us to determine how we want to worship him. Instead, he's told us what he desires from our worship. And therefore, it's our responsibility to make sure that everything we do in worship is according to his instructions. Next, think about the where we worship. Just a few verses prior in John chapter 4, Jesus addresses the subject of where true worshipers will engage in worship. The woman Jesus was talking with, a Samaritan, said to him, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship." Verse 20. Jesus responded to her in verse 21, saying, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father." Instead, Jesus said the true worshipers will worship in spirit and truth, as we saw in verses 23 and 24. This is the kind of worship the Father is seeking. So the emphasis that Jesus places on worship is not the location in which the worship takes place. Previously, the Jews saw Jerusalem as the place to worship, as that was the location of the temple that was used in worshiping God. And the Samaritans had designated Mount Gerizim as their place of worship. However, those who are Christians are the temple of God, because the Spirit of God dwells in us, 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 and 20. And all Christians are part of a royal priesthood, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. And therefore all Christians can worship God in spirit and truth wherever they have the opportunity. The place is insignificant to the worship. What God requires is that Christians give true worship to God, as specified in John 4, verses 23 and 24. As long as this is done, it does not matter whether the worship takes place in a building that's specifically designed to aid the worship, in the middle of a field, in a privately owned home, in a cave, or in a prison. Next, I want you to think about when we worship. We need to consider when Christians should worship God. Generally speaking, the New Testament demonstrates that Christians can worship God whenever and wherever they have the opportunity to do so. Just like Paul and Silas were singing and praying and worshiped God when they were in prison, Acts 16 and verse 25, Christians today should have the desire to worship God as often as they have the opportunity to do so. Although it's true that Christians can worship whenever and wherever they have the opportunity to do so, there is a special emphasis in the New Testament on the first day of the week in the assemblies of the local church. Yes, there is a reason to be part of a local church. In fact, there are at least two activities of worship that the New Testament only shows being done in the assemblies of the local church. Acts chapter 20 and verse 7 says, "Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight." Similarly, the disciples were told to lay something aside on the first day of the week, 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 and 2. So Christians should be committed to assembling with the local church for worship on the first day of every week. And then we need to consider the responsibility to attend the worship assemblies that are designated by the local church. God instructs that Christians not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, Hebrews 10 and verse 25. So members of a local church are commanded to be present whenever the church assembles together, if they have the opportunity and ability to do so. And this is even true if the church assembles more than once on the first day of the week, or on a day other than the first day of the week. For there is a responsibility to submit to the elders of a local church and to one another, as you can see in Hebrews 13 verse 17 and Ephesians 5 verse 21. And this applies to the times they have designated for the church to assemble for worship. Well, having established some basic facts about worship, we will dive a little deeper. Now we want to consider the worship that is specific to the assemblies of the local church. The Scriptures demonstrate that the local church can and should assemble in one place to engage in worship, as you can see in Acts 20 and verse 7 and 1 Corinthians 14 verses 23 through and 26. And therefore, as we focus on training worship leaders, this is a major part of our study, and we need to consider some of the fundamentals about these worship assemblies. Remember that in order to engage in true worship, we must worship God in spirit and truth. And if we're going to worship God according to the truth, we must consider what activities God authorizes for our worship in the assemblies of the local church. And note that we'll be focusing on each one of these in greater detail later in this series. First, we worship God in the assemblies of the local church through prayer. Not only is prayer something that Christians ought to do individually, but it is something we ought to do collectively. For instance, whenever the Apostle Peter was in prison, constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church, Acts 12, verse 5. And there were many gathered together praying in Acts 12 and verse 12. Second, we worship God in the assemblies of the local church through singing. Colossians 3 and verse 16 says, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord." Notice that the kinds of songs to be sung are psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. They are all to be focused on spiritual things. And notice that there is no authority given in the New Testament to worship God with a musical instrument. Third, we worship God in the assemblies of the local church through gospel preaching. Listen to Acts 20 and verse 7 again. "Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight." So when the local church in Troas assembled together on the first day of the week, Paul preached the gospel to them. You should note that the Greek word for spoke designates a more formal kind of speaking, not just a casual conversation. Fourth, we worship God in the assemblies of the local church through partaking of the Lord's Supper. Once again, Acts 20 and verse 7 indicates that the disciples broke bread whenever they came together on the first day of the week. This is a direct reference to the Lord's Supper. And this is the only passage in the New Testament that teaches us when the Christians engaged in this act of worship. It is to be done on the first day of every week. And fifth, we worship God in the assemblies of the local church through contributing to the collection. 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 and 2 is the only passage that teaches us how the local church raises money. It says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come." So the members of the local church were expected to contribute to this collection on the first day of the week. Besides these 5 activities, there is no authority for any other activity of worship during the assemblies of the local church. All of this worship must be offered to God in spirit and in truth. And 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 40 adds another qualification for our worship in these assemblies. It says, "Let all things be done decently and in order." The context of 1 Corinthians 14 demonstrates that the Corinthian church was experiencing some confusion during their assemblies. Verse 26 says, "How is it then, brethren, whenever you come together, each of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation? Let all things be done for edification." Their confusion evidently stemmed from individuals who possessed spiritual gifts and were all trying to use their spiritual gifts during the assemblies, but they were not doing so in an orderly way that resulted in the edification of the whole church. So in verses 27 through 40, Paul gave them some rules that would promote order. Although we do not possess these kinds of miraculous spiritual gifts today, we still must be certain that everything we do during the assemblies of the church is done decently and orderly. 1 Corinthians 14 verse 33 says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches." If we do not have order in the assemblies, chaos and confusion can take over and result in spiritual harm rather than spiritual edification. Although Christians can worship God outside of the assemblies of a local church, there is a great opportunity for Christians to be built up in the faith, that is edified, whenever we engage in collective worship. And therefore we should not want to do anything that hinders that edification. We also need to recognize concerning the worship in the assemblies of the local church that God has only authorized men to lead the worship in the local church. So as we consider the great responsibility of leading worship, we should consider that it falls on the shoulders of Christian men. Consider 3 points to provide proof. First, consider 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. It says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in church." The context of this passage is the same that we just considered regarding doing things decently and orderly in the assemblies. One of the rules God has given for the assemblies of the local church is that women keep silent at these times, except for participating in the singing. There can be no doubt that God does not permit women to speak in church, that is, in the assemblies of the church. Second, consider 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 11 and 14 through 14. "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression." If a woman would take a leading role in the worship, when a Christian man is present, she would not be learning in quietness and submission. Instead, she would be usurping the authority that God has given to Christian men. And remember that God possesses all authority and can give authority to whomever he wishes. In this case, he has given authority to Christian men. Third, consider approved example throughout the New Testament scriptures. Although the New Testament provides examples of women who served God, worshiped God, and even taught others the gospel, like women prophets, there is no example of women taking a leading role and the worship of the local church, or usurping the authority of Christian men. You can search through the entire New Testament and observe that the approved example is only that Christian men were engaged in leading the worship of the local church. As we continue in this study, we need to consider the authority that is possessed by the leaders of the local church. These are the elders of a church. But in the absence of elders, the men must make some decisions concerning the work and worship of the local church. Hebrews 13 verse 17 says, "Obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls, as those who must give account. Let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you." This is applicable to the oversight elders have in a local church. And Ephesians 5 and verse 21 says, "Submitting to one another in the fear of God." Certainly, this would be applicable to the decisions made by the men of the congregation in the absence of elders. Now, here's the point I want to make. Those who make decisions for a local church must address the worship of the local church at various times. It is part of their responsibility to make sure that, number one, all things are done according to the Bible's teachings about the collective worship of the local church, and number two, that all things are done decently and orderly. So there will be some decisions that are made that involve absolute Bible commands, examples, and necessary inference that must be followed by those who are leading the congregation in worship. And then there will be matters of judgment that also must be followed. For instance, the leaders of the local church, in making sure that the worship is carried out in decency and order that will lead to edification, have some authority to make decisions about things like the order of the services, the length of the services, the way individuals dress to lead the services, etc. And even though these are matters of judgment, a spirit of unity, respect, and submission should be demonstrated by all those who are leading the worship and by the entire congregation. For our goals of serving and worshiping God in the most effective way must always prevail and bind us closely together in love. Now, we have seen that worship is an awesome responsibility and opportunity that has been afforded to us. And we have seen some basics about worshiping God in the assemblies of the local church, including that God has given Christian men the responsibility to lead these worship assemblies. So we need to consider the need to train men to lead the worship assemblies of the local church. Let me debunk what I believe is a popular myth. I think that it is common for Christians to believe that there are natural worship leaders. For instance, natural song leaders, natural public speakers, etc. And while I do not deny that each one of us may have some degree of natural abilities, I believe this is not the main reason that some Christian men seem to do so well at leading the worship. Instead, I believe that the majority of Christian men who excel at leading people in worship in any of the avenues of worship do so because they have learned how to do it well and have practiced a lot. That is, they really work at it. Just as no one is a natural mechanic, welder, pipe fitter, coal miner, teacher, insurance salesman, electrician, engineer, etc., no one is a natural worship leader. Do you really believe that someone could be born into this world, never participate in any kind of worship service, or have any contact whatsoever with anything that is done in a worship service, and suddenly be able to effectively lead God's people in true worship because of some kind of natural ability? That is absolutely absurd. Well, just as we recognize the need for training in all of the fields of labor I mentioned previously, we must recognize the need for training men to lead the worship in the assemblies of the local church. We cannot expect for men to be baptized and then take on leadership take on a leadership role in the worship without helping them learn how. And we should not assume that those who have been sitting in the pews for many years do not need any encouragement, any training, or any practice in leading the worship. The fact is, every Christian man can benefit from being trained in leading the worship of God, no matter how experienced or inexperienced he may be. Another point concerning the need to train men to lead the worship is to improve the worship of the church. Leaders make a difference in the worship of a local church. If not, why would Paul instruct that all things be done in decency and order? 1 Corinthians 14, verse 40. It would not make a difference if the leaders of the worship do not matter. Throughout the Scriptures, we can plainly see that leaders make a big difference. Good leaders help people go in good directions. Bad leaders hinder those who want to serve to the best of their abilities. It's no different regarding leaders of the worship in a local church. You see, if leaders do not train themselves, they can become a distraction to the congregation that is attempting to worship God and be an obstacle to people worshiping God. And sometimes, worship leaders can even reach a point where they become a hindrance to true worship. For instance, some individuals may not have prepared to lead the worship, and their lack of preparedness robs God of worship, the worship he deserves, and does not stimulate the minds of those who are prepared to worship God. Or some worship leaders make themselves the focus of the worship, and the worshipers struggle to focus on God rather than the one leading the worship. In contrast, there are worship leaders who are very effective in what they do. They manage to get the worshipers to put their focus where it needs to be and get the most out of the worshipers they can. They are prepared for leading the worship to the best of their abilities, and no one is shorted in the worship. God receives the best the worshipers can give him, and the worshipers are satisfied with the worship they have given, as well as edified by the worship. And then another point to consider concerning the need to train men to lead the worship is to help men grow in their service. Since no one is a natural worship leader, and since worship leaders make such a difference in the worship of the congregation, the men of the congregation who have been given the responsibility to lead the worship must be committed to growing in their service. I believe that it's far too common for Christian men to stay inside of their comfort zones with regard to leading the worship. For some, this means that they do not do anything to lead the worship. For others, this means that they never grow in how they do lead the worship, either in the acts of worship they're willing to lead or in their abilities to lead what they already lead. Yet a growing and thriving congregation should always be developing Christian men to do more in leading the worship of God. And each Christian man should recognize his own responsibility to grow in his service and do the best he can to do more. For instance, 2 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 18 instructs Christians, but grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And Hebrews 5 and verses 12 through 14 says, For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. God does not want us to stay stagnant in our service. Instead, he wants us to always be trying to grow in how we can serve him. This includes how we lead the worship. Although we all have different abilities and opportunities, we should be committed to using what we have the best that we possibly can. And we should always be pushing ourselves to get ourselves out of our comfort zones and do even more than we have done in the past. For you never know when there will be a need for you to lead people in worship in ways that perhaps you have never done in the past. Having established some basics about worship, I want to set the right expectations for this course in the few moments we have left. This course is designed to be helpful to every man who considers leading the worship in the assemblies of a local church. But it is not designed to be an exhaustive guide to everything that we could discuss. So let's consider some things you should and should not expect from this course. Let's start with a few big things that you should not expect from this course. First, you should not expect to learn everything you need to know or that will help you in being an effective worship leader. Although I do hope to provide you with plenty of useful information and helpful tips, you must recognize that this will be a lifelong process of learning and growth. Second, you should not expect to learn a secret that will make getting out of your comfort zone less uncomfortable. We call it our comfort zone because it is comfortable to us. So anything that moves us outside of that will be somewhat uncomfortable for us. But I do hope to encourage you to do that anyways, and to help you overcome any fears you may have. Third, you should not expect to be the best worship leader that the local church has ever seen because you went through this course. Don't expect to be a completely different worship leader overnight. Don't expect to never make mistakes. Again, this will take work, and plenty of it. And even after we put in a great deal of work, there will always be something to improve. But that's okay. Next, there are a handful of things that I do hope will be accomplished by this course, and you should expect the following. First, do expect to be encouraged to do your part as a worship leader. I want every Christian man to feel the weight of the responsibility and the opportunity to lead people in the worship of our awesome God. So I will try to encourage you to do as much as you can every time I have the opportunity. Second, do expect to learn about leading each activity of worship in the local church. As we go through this brief series of lessons, we will consider each activity of worship. And we want to look at the scriptural guidance on leading the worship in that area, as well as some practical advice that will help us do things effectively, decently, and orderly. Third, do expect to be challenged and to challenge yourself. If you are not willing to step outside of your comfort zone, this course will be of little or no help to you. Because those who are unwilling to do anything besides what they are already doing will not be open to suggestions or consider leading in any other aspect of the worship. But one of my greatest goals in this series is to challenge each one to do better and to do more to lead people in worship. As we close this first lesson, leading people in worship is one of the greatest things that we can ever do while we live on this earth. And therefore, we should want to do the very best that we possibly can to contribute. As Christian men, it is our responsibility to do so. And God will hold us accountable if we are robbing Him in this way. So let us each consider ourselves and how we lead others in worship as we continue through this series of lessons. May God be with us all in this endeavor.